Is the presidency of Donald Trump influencing authoritarian tendencies globally, particularly in Africa? To assess this properly, we need analytical clarity rather than rhetorical framing. Authoritarianism does not spread through personality alone. It spreads through incentives, institutional erosion, and geopolitical signaling. Analysis. What is authoritarian drift? In political science, authoritarian drift refers to weakening judicial independence, politicizing security forces, undermining electoral integrity, concentrating executive power, delegitimizing media, extending tenure beyond constitutional norms. This phenomenon has been documented globally over the last 15 years, not beginning with Trump. Scholars often cite democratic backsliding in Eastern Europe, executive aggrandizement in parts of Latin America, entrenched incumbency in several African states. So the trend predates and exceeds any single U.S. administration. 2. Did Trump normalize executive aggression? Trump's presidency was marked by confrontational rhetoric toward media, aggressive use of executive authority, skepticism toward multilateral institutions, rejection of certain democratic norms. Supporters frame this as populist disruption. Critics frame it as institutional erosion. The key question: did this behavior create global permission structures for strongman politics? There are 3 mechanisms through which that could occur. 1. Norm signaling. When the leader of a historically influential democracy attacks institutions, courts, media, elections, it weakens the moral leverage of that democracy abroad. 2. Diplomatic deprioritization. If human rights and democratic governance become secondary to transactional diplomacy, elites in other countries face less external pressure. 3. Narrative legitimization. Populist rhetoric about fake news, deep state, and electoral fraud has been echoed by leaders worldwide. But correlation is not causation. We must avoid over-attribution. 3. African political dynamics, internal versus external drivers. In Africa, executive entrenchment is influenced primarily by weak institutional checks and balances, patronage-based political economies, control over security forces, constitutional manipulation for term extensions, resource dependency. Examples across the continent show patterns of term limit removal, electoral irregularities, constitutional reinterpretation. These trends began long before Trump's presidency. External influence plays a role, but domestic institutional design and political culture are primary drivers. 4. Did U.S. posture shift under Trump? Under Trump, U.S. foreign policy often emphasized sovereignty over multilateral pressure, reduced emphasis on democracy promotion, strategic competition, especially with China. When democracy promotion is deprioritized, authoritarian-leaning leaders face less public pressure from Washington. However, this shift did not eliminate U.S. institutional capacity to sanction or criticize governance abuses. Sanctions regimes and aid conditionalities continued in some cases. The broader geopolitical context also matters. China's infrastructure diplomacy model, Russia's security partnerships, Gulf state financial influence. These actors provide alternative alliances not contingent on democratic reform. V. The strongman emulation thesis. There is a theory in comparative politics that strong leaders imitate other powerful leaders to justify their own concentration of authority. But for emulation to occur, 3 conditions must exist. Domestic elite incentives align with power consolidation. Institutions are weak enough to permit it. Public legitimacy can be maintained, through nationalism, economic growth, or repression. African leaders do not require American precedent to consolidate power, many systems already possess structural vulnerabilities. 6. The danger of oversimplification. It is analytically risky to claim Trump created authoritarianism in Africa. That framing assumes African political actors lack agency. Domestic institutions are passive. Global trends are unidirectional from Washington. Authoritarian drift in Africa has roots in post-colonial state formation challenges, military political legacies, centralized economic control, constitutional fragility. These structural dynamics precede recent U.S. administrations. 7. Where influence may exist. More cautiously, one could argue, when the United States appears internally polarized and institutionally strained, its democratic model loses normative authority. When powerful democracies appear unstable, leaders elsewhere can justify executive consolidation as necessary. Global democratic credibility matters. If U.S. institutions withstand internal strain and enforce accountability, the signal strengthens rule of law norms globally. If they fail, it weakens normative pressure abroad. 8. The deeper question, is democracy in retreat globally? According to multiple democracy indexes, Freedom House, VDEM, democratic backsliding has been occurring globally for over a decade. Drivers include digital disinformation, economic inequality, populist mobilization, security crises, institutional fatigue. Trump was part of this era but not its origin. 9. Africa's real accountability challenge. In many African states, the core issue is not foreign influence. It is weak separation of powers, lack of judicial independence, security forces aligned with incumbents, patronage networks tied to state resources. Authoritarian resilience thrives where opposition cannot organize freely. Media lacks independence. Civil society faces restriction. These conditions are internally generated. Conclusion. Did Trump's presidency symbolically embolden populist or executive-heavy governance globally? Possibly at the level of rhetoric and norm signaling. Did it create authoritarianism in Africa? No. The structural drivers are domestic and historically rooted. The more accurate framing is: global democratic norms weakened during a period of geopolitical fragmentation. The United States, under multiple administrations, has struggled to project consistent democratic leadership. Authoritarian drift is multi-causal. It is not exported like a product. It emerges where institutions are fragile and power incentives favor consolidation. Comparative governance analysis, United States, China, Africa. Regime architecture, institutional foundations. United States, constitutional liberal democracy. The United States operates under a separation of powers framework codified in 1787. Authority is divided among executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Elections are competitive and regular, media operates with constitutional protection, courts exercise judicial review. Recent constitutional stress has centered around presidential authority, especially during the tenure of Donald Trump, where executive power, electoral legitimacy, and institutional independence were intensely contested. However, institutional friction, impeachment proceedings, judicial review, federalism conflicts demonstrates that constraints remain operational. Core features: competitive multi-party elections, independent judiciary, federalism, state-level autonomy, constitutional rights framework. Primary vulnerability: political polarization undermining institutional trust. China, party-state authoritarian governance. The People's Republic of China is governed under a single-party system led by the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. Authority is centralized, with leadership consolidated under Xi Jinping. China does not separate executive, legislative, and judicial powers in the liberal democratic sense. Instead, governance flows through party hierarchy. Political legitimacy derives from performance, economic growth, stability, poverty reduction, rather than electoral competition. Core features: one-party rule, Centralized decision-making. Long-term strategic planning. Integrated state capital model. Primary vulnerability. Limited institutional mechanisms for leadership turnover or dissent. Africa, governance diversity across 54 states. Africa is not a monolith. Governance models range from multi-party democracies, example Ghana, Botswana, to hybrid regimes and consolidated authoritarian systems. Common structural challenges include executive dominance, weak separation of powers, patronage-based political economies, resource dependency. Some African constitutions resemble Western liberal frameworks but lack institutional enforcement strength. The gap between formal constitutional design and operational practice is often significant. Primary vulnerability. Institutional fragility rather than ideological uniformity. 2. Executive power and tenure dynamics. United States. Presidential terms are limited to 2 4-year terms, 22nd Amendment. Peaceful transfer of power is a constitutional norm reinforced institutionally, even after contested elections. Even during political crises, legal disputes are resolved through courts. This procedural containment is a defining characteristic of U.S. governance resilience. China. Term limits for the presidency were removed in 2018, allowing indefinite tenure under Xi Jinping. Leadership transitions historically occurred within party consensus mechanisms, but institutional personalization has increased. Stability is prioritized over pluralism. Africa. Term limit politics are a major governance fault line. Several African leaders have amended constitutions to extend tenure. Others have upheld term limits successfully. The variation suggests that institutional enforcement capacity is decisive. Civil society strength influences outcomes. Military alignment often determines political durability. 3. Legitimacy models. System source of legitimacy. United States electoral consent plus constitutional order. China performance legitimacy, growth, stability. Africa, varies, elections, liberation narratives, patronage networks. The U.S. model assumes citizens legitimize government through competitive elections. China's model assumes economic outcomes justify political authority. African systems often blend electoral legitimacy with clientelistic distribution and nationalist narratives. 4. Economic governance and state capacity. United States. Market-oriented capitalism with regulatory oversight. Private sector dominance with state intervention during crisis, example 2008 financial crisis, pandemic response. Strength. Innovation ecosystem. Financial depth. Weakness. Inequality. Political capture by economic elites. China. State-directed capitalism. Strategic sectors, technology, infrastructure, energy, are guided by industrial policy. Infrastructure financing is coordinated globally through mechanisms like the Belt and Road Initiative. Strength. Rapid infrastructure deployment. Long-term planning continuity. Weakness. Debt accumulation. Limited transparency. Africa. Mixed economic models with high commodity dependence in many states. State capacity varies significantly. Fiscal constraints often limit independent industrial strategy. External actors China, US, EU, Gulf states play significant roles in infrastructure and financing. The governance challenge is not ideology but institutional execution. Influence dynamics in Africa. U.S. influence traditionally emphasizes electoral democracy, governance reforms, civil society support. However, U.S. policy often shifts between normative pressure and strategic pragmatism. Under Trump, democracy promotion rhetoric was less prominent, focusing more on sovereignty and transactional diplomacy. China's influence. China offers Infrastructure financing. Non-conditional loans. Political non-interference doctrine. For African leaders, this provides alternative financing without governance conditionality. Rapid project implementation. Critics argue this may enable executive concentration of power if domestic accountability mechanisms are weak. 6. Authoritarian emulation versus structural incentives. There is limited empirical evidence that African authoritarian drift is directly caused by U.S. presidential style. More influential factors. Resource control. Security sector alignment. Constitutional enforcement. Economic patronage networks. China's model may be attractive for its economic performance without democratic conditionality. However, adoption of governance style is constrained by domestic political culture and institutional design. Authoritarianism spreads less by imitation and more by incentive alignment. 7. Institutional resilience comparison. Dimension United States, China, Africa, varies. Judicial independence strong, party aligned uneven. Electoral competition high, non-mixed. Leadership turnover regularized, party determined, mixed. Media freedom high, with polarization, restricted, mixed. Civil society active, controlled, variable. The United States demonstrates institutional friction but durability. China demonstrates centralized efficiency but limited pluralism. Africa demonstrates institutional diversity with fragility as a recurring constraint. 8. Strategic implications for Africa. African states face 3 strategic governance choices. Strengthen institutional checks, rule of law model. Prioritize centralized developmental state structures. Maintain hybrid patronage systems. The long-term stability of African governance will depend less on US or Chinese examples and more on judicial independence, civil-military relations, transparent fiscal management, electoral credibility. External powers influence incentives but do not determine outcomes. 9. Conclusion. The United States, under Trump and beyond, experienced democratic stress but retained institutional checks. China offers centralized strategic governance without electoral competition. Africa contains diverse systems navigating structural development constraints. Authoritarian governance in Africa cannot be attributed solely to American leadership style. It is primarily shaped by domestic institutional architecture and political economy. Global influence modifies incentives. It does not replace internal agency. Governance at a crossroads, is global power politics reshaping democracy in Africa? In recent years, debates about democracy, executive power, and authoritarian drift have intensified worldwide. The presidency of Donald Trump coincided with a period of global democratic backsliding. At the same time, China's expanding global footprint under Xi Jinping has offered an alternative governance model centered on centralized authority and state-led development. For many observers, a pressing question emerges: are global power shifts and the political style of major powers influencing governance trajectories in Africa? This investigation examines the structural realities behind that claim. The answer is more complex than simple imitation. The global democratic backslide. Before attributing governance changes in Africa to external figures, context matters. Over the last 15 years, democracy indexes from institutions such as Freedom House and the V-Dem Institute have documented a steady global decline in liberal democratic standards. This trend spans continents from Eastern Europe to Latin America and parts of Asia. The causes are multi-layered. Economic inequality, institutional fatigue, digital misinformation, polarization, security crises, populist mobilization. The period overlapping Trump's presidency did not initiate this pattern, rather, it intensified debate about it. The norm signaling effect. The United States has long positioned itself as a global advocate of democratic norms, rule of law, press freedom, electoral transparency. When its own institutions appear strained, the symbolic impact is significant. Under Trump, rhetoric attacking media outlets as fake news, disputes over election integrity, and confrontational executive behavior became global headlines. While American institutions, courts, federalism structures, Congress remained operational, the optics of democratic instability were widely broadcast. For African political elites observing from abroad, this had two potential effects. Reduced moral leverage: if the U.S. struggles with its own democratic disputes, its ability to pressure others weakens. Rhetorical cover: leaders accused of undermining institutions could argue that Western democracies face similar turbulence. However, rhetorical cover is not structural causation. Domestic political incentives remain decisive. China's model: development without electoral pluralism. China presents a different influence. Its governance model prioritizes centralized authority, rapid infrastructure deployment, and long-term industrial strategy without multi-party competition. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has financed and constructed major infrastructure projects across Africa: ports, railways, highways, energy facilities. Crucially, Chinese financing is generally framed around non-interference in domestic political affairs. For African leaders, this offers access to large-scale capital, faster implementation timelines, reduced governance conditionality. Critics argue this approach can entrench executive dominance if domestic accountability mechanisms are weak. Supporters argue it accelerates development without imposing external political models. China does not explicitly export authoritarian ideology, but its state-led developmental success provides an implicit alternative to liberal democratic sequencing. Africa's internal drivers of executive dominance. To understand governance outcomes in Africa, one must examine internal structural factors. 1. Constitutional manipulation. Several African leaders have amended or reinterpreted constitutional term limits to extend tenure. 2. Patronage economies. Control